Ladies and gentlemen, there comes a time in your life when you stop seeing love as something to prove and start seeing it as something to protect. This message is for the ones who gave their heart without hesitation, who showed up fully, loved deeply, and still ended up questioning their worth when it ended. If you've ever felt like you lost someone who meant everything to you, this is your reminder. You didn't lose him, he lost access to you. And today, we're going to talk about why that truth changes everything. There comes a moment when speaking becomes pointless. When everything you've said, every gentle reminder, every expression of hurt, every hope that they would meet you halfway has gone unheard. You reach a point where the words don't land anymore, not because they weren't true, but because they were never valued. And so you stop, not out of pettiness, not out of coldness, but because you realize that your energy deserves protection and your heart deserves peace. Your silence isn't an empty space, it's a message. A message that says, I'm done fighting for what you don't appreciate. It's not passive, it's not weak, it's powerful, deliberate, and intentional. It speaks in ways your voice never could, because while words can be dismissed, twisted, or argued against, silence can't be ignored. It forces the other person to sit with themselves without your comfort, without your explanations, without your emotional labor cushioning their ego. When you stop reaching out, stop explaining, stop trying to fix what you didn't break, the shift is undeniable. That quiet absence says more than any long paragraph ever could. It reflects strength, it shows growth. It becomes a mirror one that reflects back everything they failed to see when they still had access to you. There's a unique ache in realizing that someone who once cared deeply has now chosen not to respond. It's unsettling, especially for someone who took your presence for granted. When you're silent, you're not playing games, you're protecting your soul. You're no longer available for conversations that leave you drained. You're not available for half love, half effort, or half apologies. And in that decision, in that dignified withdrawal, you say everything they refused to hear. It's in that silence that they start to question what they lost. It's when they feel the absence of your emotional presence that they begin to understand what it meant to be held by your energy, your consistency, your patience. Suddenly, every message that used to light up their phone is missed. Every time they scroll past your name, there's a weight. And it's not because you left in anger, it's because you left with grace. Silence is powerful because it places the burden of awareness on them. It says, I'm not here to make you understand anymore. You will either feel it or you won't. And if they do, that realization can be unbearable. Because the quietest heartbreaks are often the loudest in memory. You didn't scream, you didn't slam the door, you just stopped answering, and that stillness, it echoes long after the noise of the world fades. They may never admit it, they may act unbothered, but internally they know something has changed. Your silence creates a void not just of communication, but of comfort. And when people lose comfort they once took for granted, it forces reflection. It forces a confrontation with the truth that someone beautiful, someone rare, someone who truly cared is now gone, not because they stopped caring, but because they finally started caring about themselves. You aren't withholding words out of resentment. You're withholding because you know that no matter how much you say, it won't change someone who doesn't want to change. You've spent time expressing. You've opened up, been vulnerable, been honest. But now you're choosing a different kind of truth, one that doesn't require explanation. In silence, you've reclaimed your peace. You've shifted the focus back to you. No more begging to be seen. No more waiting to be understood. No more trying to earn the bare minimum. Your quiet is not confusion, it is clarity. And for the one who lost you, it is a deafening realization, because in the end, people remember silence. They remember who stopped trying. They remember who stopped responding, and they remember the moment when your love turned into distance, not with anger, but with calm certainty. And there is no sound louder than that. You gave your heart. Not in pieces, not with conditions. You handed it over fully not because you were weak, but because you believed in love that meant something. And there's a difference between giving your heart and losing your dignity. You weren't desperate, you were devoted. Devotion is misunderstood. It's often mistaken for neediness by people who don't understand the strength it takes to stay loyal in a world where everyone is chasing the next best thing. You weren't desperate for attention, you just didn't want to play games. You didn't need constant validation, you just craved consistency. And that's not weakness, that's emotional depth. You weren't trying to force a connection. You were nurturing one. There's a difference. You showed up. You cared. You made time, even when it wasn't convenient. You forgave mistakes that should have been lessons. You explained yourself when silence would have been easier. And you stayed not because you didn't know how to walk away, but because you believed that love was worth effort. That doesn't make you foolish. It makes you human. You knew their flaws. You saw their blind spots. But still, you chose to be patient. You weren't desperate for love. You were willing to love someone even when they didn't know how to fully receive it. You saw potential. You saw what they could be if only they stepped up. So you waited. But here's the part they never understood. Devotion doesn't mean you'll wait forever. It doesn't mean you'll lower your standards, abandon your self-respect, or shrink yourself just to make a relationship work. It means you're willing to try, willing to give, willing to be vulnerable until you're not, because even the most devoted hearts have a limit. They thought your love was based on dependency, that without them you'd collapse. But that was never the truth. You weren't clinging because you needed them, you were holding on because you believed in them. And belief is one of the most powerful, most selfless things you can give another person. They mistook your patience for passivity. They mistook your loyalty for a lack of options. They mistook your consistency for weakness, and that's where they failed to understand you. You weren't afraid to walk away. You just didn't want to. You stayed because you saw value in what you were building, and because walking away from someone you love is never easy, even when you know you deserve more. Devotion is quiet strength. It doesn't scream or demand or beg. It just shows up again and again. It does the hard emotional work. It stays through confusion. It holds space when the other person is still trying to figure themselves out. But devotion doesn't mean losing yourself. It doesn't mean tolerating neglect or emotional distance. At some point, the most loving thing you can do for yourself is to leave. They thought you stayed because you had no choice. What they never realized was that you were choosing them every single day. You were choosing to love when detachment would have been safer. You were choosing to give when it was easier to shut down. That's not desperation, that's courage. You risked being hurt. You risked not being met at the same level. You risked being misunderstood, and even with all that, you gave it your all. That's what makes you powerful. Because most people only love with half of their heart, just enough to protect their pride. But you loved fully knowing the cost, and now they're left wondering why the energy changed, why you stopped reaching out, why you don't check in like you used to. What they don't see is that your silence isn't sudden, it's a result, the outcome of someone who kept showing up and eventually realized they were the only one doing so. You were never desperate for a relationship. You were devoted to a connection. You just thought they were two. But devotion, when taken for granted, transforms, not into bitterness, but into wisdom. And with wisdom comes the decision to protect your peace, even if it means letting go of someone you once held close. Because no matter how deeply you love, your devotion was never meant to be one-sided. He didn't expect you to grow, not really. He expected you to hurt, to miss him, to wait. He expected that you'd keep checking your phone, rereading old messages, hoping for a hey that never came. He expected you to stay stuck in the story where he was the central character and you were just lost without him. That's the role he had in mind for you, the one who stays emotionally available long after the door has closed. But you didn't. You cried, yes. You wondered what went wrong. You replayed the conversations, the turning points, the silence. You held on to what felt real, but slowly and maybe even without realizing it, something started shifting. You started coming back to yourself. It didn't happen overnight. Growth never does. It was in the small choices, like choosing not to answer that late night text, like deleting his number not out of spite, but because you finally accepted that you deserved peace. It was in rediscovering your own rhythm, in finding comfort in your own company, in rebuilding the parts of yourself that had gone quiet trying to make the relationship work. And while you were doing that work, he wasn't watching. Because he wasn't looking. He assumed that you'd always be there, just like you always had been, emotionally generous, endlessly forgiving, ready to listen even when you were the one hurting. That was the version of you he got used to. The one who gave without needing to be asked. The one who understood even when you weren't understood. But he didn't think beyond that. He never pictured a version of you that got stronger. He never imagined you smiling without needing his validation. He never thought you'd move forward while he stayed in place. And that's the part that stings the most now. Not that you're gone, but that you're no longer the same woman who waited for him to figure it out. Because now you laugh differently, you walk with more confidence, you don't shrink yourself in conversations, you speak with clarity, you've learned to say no, you've learned to mean it. There was a time when he could have come back with half effort and you might have accepted it, not because you lacked standards, but because you still loved him, because you still had hope, because you thought that maybe, just maybe, he'd finally meet you at the level you'd been offering all along. But that version of you no longer exists, the one who doubted her worth, the one who held space for someone who never prioritized her, the one who let love mean tolerating emotional confusion. You outgrew her. And in doing so, you outgrew him. He didn't expect that. He didn't expect you to choose healing over history. He didn't expect that your silence would be peaceful, not punishing. He didn't expect you to stop caring. Not entirely, but enough to stop making him your emotional priority. That's the thing about real growth. It doesn't come with fireworks. It's quiet, it's steady, it's subtle at first, but suddenly you're no longer chasing closure. You're no longer checking if he watched your story. You're no longer trying to be seen because you see yourself, and the weight of that realization, it's heavy for him now, because he's still in the story where you're waiting. Where you're lingering in the past, where your world still revolves around the memory of what could have been, but you're not there anymore. You're not replaying old conversations, you're having new ones. You're not looking for signs from the past, you're making plans for your future. You're not stuck in who he wanted you to be, you're becoming everything you were meant to be. And the truth is, he didn't expect to lose you like this. Not to another person, but to your own evolution. Because when you finally started choosing yourself, the story changed, not with drama, not with closure, but with growth, the kind he never thought you'd be brave enough to choose. And now he's left staring at a version of you he never imagined, unbothered, unattached, and undeniably transformed. Regret doesn't always come crashing in with grand gestures and tearful apologies. It doesn't always show up in a moment of clarity or a dramatic scene where someone runs back to say everything you've been waiting to hear. Sometimes it slips in quietly, long after the chaos has settled. It sneaks in through silence, not just yours, but theirs too. Regret lives in the spaces where there used to be conversation, in the blank screen where your name no longer lights up, in the stillness of a room that once echoed with laughter, shared secrets, soft arguments, and whispered hopes. There are no fireworks when it hits. There's no closure. just a creeping awareness that something meaningful was lost and it can't be undone. He may not say it out loud, he may not even show it. But when everything goes quiet, when no one is fighting anymore, and when the dust has settled, that's when it begins. Because regret doesn't thrive in drama. It waits for the silence. It waits for stillness to show him what he refused to see when you were still trying. It's in that silence where he feels it most, not while you were still texting, calling, trying to explain how hurt you were, not while you were asking him to meet you halfway or to simply show up like you did. As long as you were still speaking, he believed he still had time, that the door hadn't fully closed, that your words, even in frustration, meant you still cared, but the moment you stopped, that's when it shifted. Because when you go quiet, when you no longer feel the need to be understood, when you let go of trying to be heard, that's when the absence becomes real, and regret is born in absence. It grows in the void. Not in chaos, not in conflict, in the calm that comes when you finally walked away with peace. He starts to notice things, noticing how no one checks in on him the way you did, noticing how the comfort he took for granted is now replaced by cold silence. Noticing how the small, ordinary moments suddenly feel empty without your energy softening them. It's not dramatic, it's not loud, it's subtle, almost invisible to everyone else, but inside him, it lingers. It's in the way he replays old conversations, wondering where it started to slip. It's in the way he looks through old photos or scrolls past your name without the courage to reach out. It's in the messages he types out and deletes. It's in the silence between the things he says and the things he wishes he had. And the worst part, there's no one to argue with anymore, no one to blame, just the echo of your absence. There's no apology big enough to erase the moments when you were giving your best and he didn't notice. No grand gesture that can undo the times you were present while he was emotionally somewhere else. No dramatic confession that can rewind to the day you finally gave up, not because you stopped caring, but because caring alone wasn't enough anymore. Regret shows up when it's too late, not because the door is locked, but because the version of you that waited, hoped, and tried no longer exists, and now the silence is doing what your words never could. It's showing him exactly what he lost. He may never say it. He may pretend he's fine. He may smile through it and keep moving, acting like your absence hasn't shifted something deep within, but it has. Because that silence, your silence, doesn't just speak, it haunts. It reminds him again and again of the space you used to fill with laughter, presence, love, and effort. It reminds him that there's no one else like you. And it reminds him that he let something rare slip away, without realizing that once the noise fades, once the drama ends, all that's left is the truth. And the truth hits hardest when the world goes quiet. It's easy to think you lost something when it ends, that because they walked away or you had to, it means they slipped out of your grasp, that somehow they got away and you're left with the ache of what could have been. But that's not what really happened. You didn't lose him. He lost access to you. He lost access to your patience, the way you would show up for him, even when he didn't ask, even when he didn't know how much he needed it. He lost access to your thoughtfulness, the way you'd pay attention to the details he didn't even notice about himself. He lost access to the way you listened not just to respond, but to understand. He lost access to a version of love that doesn't come around easily, one that's present, generous, and emotionally available. You didn't just give love, you gave space, a space where he could be himself, a space where he didn't have to perform, where he didn't have to be perfect. You gave safety, the emotional kind that doesn't ask for masks or rehearsed lines, and that kind of space is rare. Most people never find it, let alone keep it. He had that, and he lost it, not because you stopped loving him, but because you realized that your love wasn't being matched, that your emotional investment was becoming one, sided, that you were slowly disappearing in a relationship where you were supposed to feel seen. The hardest part was that you would have stayed if he had shown up, if he had grown, if he had taken responsibility, if he had met you where you were emotionally. You weren't asking for perfection, you were asking for presence, for effort, for honesty, and you were willing to give all of that in return, but he couldn't or wouldn't, and eventually you reached your edge, not because you didn't care, but because you cared too much for someone who was doing too little. Because the more you poured in, the more it hurt when it wasn't held with care. So you took a step back, and with that step, something shifted, not just in the relationship, but in you. You started seeing the truth not as a threat, but as clarity. You started honoring your feelings instead of questioning them. You stopped bending your needs to make someone else comfortable. You started valuing your own peace, and that's when he lost access, because access to you was never guaranteed. It was earned through consistency, effort, and respect, and somewhere along the way, he treated it like it was permanent, like no matter how little he gave, you would still be there. He mistook your loyalty for permanence. He assumed love meant staying, even when you were being emotionally starved. But love, real love, doesn't ask you to stay where you're not met. And you learned that the hard way. Now he feels the distance. Maybe not immediately, maybe not when he first walked away, but it hits eventually, the realization that you were a constant in a world full of distractions, that you were steady when everything else was noise. That you loved him in a way he didn't even know he needed until it was gone. He may try to come back. He may send a message, check your stories, drop a casual "how are you" like nothing happened. But what he won't say is this: he feels the absence of what he used to have access to, your softness, your loyalty, your time, your energy. And what he's really trying to figure out is whether the door is still open. But it's not, because you're not the same person who used to wait for his effort. You've grown, you've healed, and most importantly, you've raised the standard of what gets access to your heart. He didn't just lose a relationship. He lost the privilege of being let in, because that's what love is, not a right, but a privilege. And you don't lose someone who took you for granted. They lose access to someone who never should have had to beg to be seen. If this message resonated with you, if it reminded you of your worth, your strength, or the quiet power of choosing yourself, then don't keep it to yourself. Like this video if it helped you see your story more clearly. Share it with someone who needs that same reminder today, and subscribe if you're ready for more conversations that meet you where you are and help you rise from where you've been. Because this isn't the end of your story, it's the beginning of the part where you come first.